Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School initiative. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, we launch our fourth season of the podcast with my conversation with Dr. Alaina Jason. Alaina is a clinical psychologist and a mother of three creatively driven boys. Alaina is the author of the book Parenting Talent, the grown-up's guide to understanding and supporting creatively driven teens and tweens, and she is the head of a practice by the same name, specializing in coaching others and speaking and advising on the topic. The combination of Alaina's professional background in psychology and personal experience with her three creatively driven boys has enabled her to connect the dots between the science of adolescent development and the experience of young adolescents with certain creative talents, which, importantly, are not just innate traits that some kids have just been lucky to be born with.
I think when people say talent, first of all, they genuinely mean it as a compliment. Oh, that person's so talented. But it kind of undermines, for the person doing it, all the things that go into the performance or the execution that we witness. I don't know anybody who is talented at something that doesn't have to put some kind of work into it, and I would argue a great amount of work. They might come into it with a natural aptitude to some degree, but there's always going to be components to it that require hard work, perseverance, and some of it's not fun. I think there's also this idea if somebody's talented for something, it comes so naturally and it's so easy, and you're not seeing what's really happening for them to actually give you the output that you're enjoying so much. So I like to be very careful when I'm talking about these quote unquote talented kids, that we're making sure that they are acknowledging that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into the skill building that is a huge component to talent and is a never-ending pursuit.
In the first part of our conversation, Alaina and I talk about her inspirations for writing the book, which include her own creatively driven boys, as well as a noticeable gap in information for parents like her to know how to understand and support them, what talent really means, and the level of effort it requires among youth to actualize it, how the developmental changes in early adolescence affect youth in the creative arts in specific ways, including the development of identity and dealing with the many emotions that stem from vulnerability, and the evolution of young people's awareness of their own ability to affect the world and their place in it. In part 2, we talk about how parents and families can engage with creative teens and tweens in the most supportive and effective ways, including when and how to communicate, keeping pace with their rapid development to be in sync with what they need at their age and stage of development, and some of the particular issues the current generation of youth are faced with. We also talk about Alaina's next steps in helping others understand and support their own creative teens and tweens at home. That's coming up in a little bit later in this episode. Now, here's part 1 of my conversation with Alaina Jason. Alaina, it's such a delight to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So we cover a lot of ground on this podcast series, trying to explore the wide range of developmental characteristics of adolescents, especially young adolescents. So those are youth ages 10 to 15. We have mostly focused on educators and teaching and learning in school settings, as well as youth workers and programs in the out-of-school time space. But we have done a little bit, and we certainly want to do more, exploration of issues directly concerning parents and families. And while I know our talk here on creatively driven young people will touch upon those in-school and out-of-school learning environments, I'm sure, I'm just personally really excited to dive into the parent and family point of view with you. But before we get into your book, let's just get a bit of a background on you. And in full disclosure to our listeners, you and I know each other pretty well. We live in close proximity. We have kids that go to the same schools. We're in the same age range. I think your middle son and our oldest son are a few months apart in age. You are a Chicagoland native. You have been a therapist and licensed clinical psychologist for more than 20 years. Tell us a little bit about what drew you to psychology and a bit about the work you've done as a practitioner in the field.
I was kind of that person that all of my friends came to. They trusted me with things. I was always told I was a good listener. So it felt like a very natural fit because I always enjoyed helping people. Actually, what I really found fascinating was developmental psychology and the learning process and how that took place. So I was really drawn to that and ultimately decided that clinical psychology was probably the best path for me. I did almost major on the flute, which is something not everybody knows, but comes up kind of frequently when people say, wait, you have 3 kids who ended up in the creative arts. Were you a performer? And I was like, sort of. As far as my career path, as I said, I ended up going into clinical psychology, but my primary training for many years was in pediatric psychology. So I worked at a pediatric hospital. I worked with kids. At the same time I was holding that interest, my dissertation was on something very different. I did a dissertation that was on maternal identity development. So again, that parental part was also something that was always an interest to me. And when I started my private practice, it actually ended up being more on that side of things. So I've always stayed in kind of in that child, adolescent, and parenting world in terms of what I do in my clinical life.
Well, that will certainly lead into this next part of the conversation, which is getting into your book, which is titled Parenting Talent, the Grown-Up's Guide to Understanding and Supporting Creatively Driven Teens and Tweens. And I know your boys. I've seen them perform in school plays, at outdoor street festivals, and even on Broadway. So I am certain these very talented boys and young men in your household are a big motivation for writing this book. And maybe you can talk about that and talk about them a little bit as well. But this book is also an opportunity to really connect your personal experience and your professional expertise. And it would certainly be well and good for a parent of any background to share their experience. But you have the advantage of being accomplished in a field that gives you some unique insights into all of this. So tell us a bit about why you wrote this book and how it came about.
You are absolutely correct. First of all, when you have 3 boys, and this is so wrong in so many ways, but even I will fall to the stereotype of 3 boys, it's going to be all sports all the time, especially living in the suburbs of a major city. That's what you see. I just kind of thought part of the whole parenting journey was going to be loading all the sports equipment into the back of the car and doing all the things. So I had this kind of vision, and with my oldest child, that initially was the case. And this is where I feel a little bad because it didn't really necessarily even occur to either one of us necessarily to not so much encourage, but just present more opportunities to our oldest son to do things in the creative arts. It was important to me that all my children learned to play an instrument. So I should have taken a hint from the fact that when he started piano, he started a little later than some of his peers, and he caught up very quickly and was actually doing incredibly well at it and loved it, didn't have to push him to practice. And when I think of other parents talking about sometimes they were really wrestling with their kids to get them to practice, that just wasn't my experience. But it was our middle child who pretty much kind of gave us a hint of what was coming from day one. He kind of came out of the womb singing, dancing, doing all the things. We'll never forget, my younger one was very little, and I think I must have been feeding him or something in the bedroom, talking to my husband, and we heard what we thought was our oldest child sing and belt. And we were like, oh my gosh, we didn't know he could sing that well. This is crazy. My husband peeked his head out to say something and came back with this look on his face of, that was the 3-year-old. He was also one that kind of looked at us when we mentioned, oh, all your friends are going to do baseball. Do you want to join a team? And he looked at us and said, why would I want to play a sport where someone throws a ball at your head? So one by one, they all expressed various interests in the arts. We're very fortunate. We live in a community that very much supports the arts. And we have an incredibly strong musical theater program in one of our middle schools. And my oldest said, yeah, I'll try it out, and shocked us when he came home with a role and went on to do very well in that program throughout his time before middle school and during middle school. My oldest child, he had to decide between travel sports, which he had evolved into, and the arts, and ultimately decided to stick with musical theater and guitar and music. And by high school, he kind of morphed completely into contemporary music, but was very passionate about it. It was very clear it was something he probably wanted to pursue. My middle son, like I said, never wavered what he wanted to do. He was the one that was actually begging to have an agent. And we said, you don't know what an agent is. That's not, no. He was also about 3 when he said this. He's like, well, that's the one who get me on TV, right? We should have known. And I do tell the story often, but my response to him was, oh, no, honey, I'm sorry. Those kids are weird and their parents are weirder. Careful what you say, because 2 or 3 years later was the weirder parent. He likes to tell the story from his perspective of he begged all those years, and within 18 months of us allowing him to go ahead and try to pursue getting an agent, he had been on Chicago Med and was on Broadway playing young Simba in The Lion King. Our youngest was watching his brothers look like having a whole lot of fun with all of this and kind of said, well, I want to do some of that. And like I said, I wanted all of my kids to play an instrument. So they all started piano, and we kind of had laid out, play an instrument through 8th grade. If you love it, great. If you don't, no problem. You can quit at that point. My youngest, who likes to push against things a little bit, he ultimately ended up playing drums. So we had to deal with that. But I looked up at one point and said, oh my gosh, they're all on this creative path. How do I support this? What do I do? How do I help them and nurture this? And so I'm going to look for all the resources and I'm going to get some answers. And when I went out there looking, what I discovered was that there was a lot of information that I could easily access that talked about how to help your child become more creative. That was never an issue in my house. We did not have to encourage creativity. I was looking for something about how do I support it? How do I understand it? How do I make sense of things like when my child says, I really, really, really want to do this, but then they're doing nothing to practice or prepare for it or whatever. That was always kind of in the back of my mind. And then I wound up having to go to New York with my middle while he was on Broadway. And now I'm dealing with this whole different level of kids who are taking this whole artistic thing in such a different way. And yet the exact same issues I was seeing was happening with these Broadway kids as the kids who were, participating in their little community things for fun. The issues were the same. And I found myself thinking of a lot of different things the same way and answering questions for people over and over again. The same questions would come up. And that's kind of where the idea of this book came about. Over time, I just started keeping track of all the things and how did I put it together. And shortly thereafter, I started writing the book.
The title Parenting Talent, and you talk about this in the book, the collective we here often think in our minds and also talk about people, including young people, as if talent is somehow maybe different than hard work. There's some of this dichotomy between those who are just naturally gifted versus those who have to put in more effort to be successful. You talked about your older one who started playing later and caught up really quickly. Some might have said, well, he just has talent. He's just kind of naturally gifted. You argue that it's more nuanced than that, and that the way we think about and talk about talent has consequences for youth development. Say more about talent and what it really means.
I think when people say talent, first of all, they genuinely mean it as a compliment. Oh, that person's so talented. But it kind of undermines for the person doing it all the things that go into the performance or the execution that we witness. I don't know anybody who is talented at something that doesn't have to put some kind of work into it. And I would argue a great amount of work. They might come into it with a natural aptitude to some degree, but there's always going to be components to it that require hard work, perseverance. And some of it's not fun. I think there's also this idea if somebody's talented for something, it comes so naturally and it's so easy. And you're not seeing what's really happening for them to actually give you the output that you're enjoying so much. I think I used in the book an example of my older son. And my oldest son has this ability to seem like he is completely comfortable on stage. But that was actually work for him. He was somebody who had a lot of anxiety before performances, still very much enjoyed performances. And if you talk to a lot of performers, they will report the same thing. Even though they have this tremendous anxiety, once they're out there performing, they're doing fine and they're having a great time. But because of that, my son did have to work at that. And ultimately, he is a contemporary musician at this point. And if you think about when you watch a performance of an individual or a band, there is a part where you have to be able to interact with the audience and you've got to be able to banter back and forth and feeling comfortable moving on stage. And all of those things are things that he had to work at to really feel comfortable in his skin up there. If he had said, oh, I don't have a talent for being on stage, that might have led him to only do things behind the scenes. So I like to be very careful when I'm talking about these quote unquote talented kids that we're making sure that they are acknowledging that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into the skill building that is a huge component to talent and is a never-ending pursuit. You won't talk to someone who is a famous musician who's going to say they've ever stopped practicing or working at it. They're always saying, yeah, no, it's constant work. That doesn't mean they're not talented. It just means that talent isn't in and of itself enough to kind of keep people pursuing it without making any kind of progress.
As I mentioned at the top, our focus here is young people ages 10 to 15, which in the education world, that most often spans the upper grades in elementary school, through middle school, and into the first year at least of high school. So it's a pretty broad range, and they're making a lot of transitions in that time period. And a lot happens to youth in this period, as you well know, developmentally, physically, cognitively, socially, emotionally. And I want to touch upon a lot of these, if we can, as it pertains to youth in the creative space. Maybe just start by talking about some of the specific developmental changes that you witness and experience with your boys as they went through this particular age period in the creative space. What were the top 3 or top 5 things that you encountered?
One of the things that I noticed that happens for a lot of kids is these kids who are in elementary school who love the arts, especially the performing arts, and they just no problem getting out there and just sharing it with everyone. They seem pretty fearless because they love it. And a lot of parents will see the shift that happens where they still love it, but they're far more reticent to perform in public. I will talk about it as kind of that fear of shining. They don't want to stand out in any way. When you think of it in a developmental context, which is how I kind of put it for parents who are worried or concerned, what's happening? Am I pushing them into something they don't want to do? And I like to talk about it like if you think about what's happening developmentally, it starts to make a lot more sense. So for me, with my boys, when I kind of was able to take a step back and say, well, what's going on here? Why were you fearless? I mean, all of a sudden you're just not comfortable with this. This is exactly the age group you're talking about. Their entire job is to find their identity. That's what they need to do. They need an identity separate of us as their parents and adults. The first thing you're going to see is they are going to pull away from their parents. And where do they tend to move to? Their peers. So younger children will look for validation, support. That's going to come from parents, teachers, and other adults. But as they move into this middle school age, it shifts and they're concerned suddenly about their friends and their peers. Friends can usually be pretty okay for a lot of creative artists because their friends are also other creative artists. But when you look at the peer group in a larger context, they may not all have that same kind of signing off on this being a great thing or a fun thing or a good thing. So suddenly they're looking at, yeah, it's great if you thought I did a great job, Mom, but this person over here says I'm a show off. So I don't know that I'm going to do that in public anymore. So you have this individuation part that's supposed to be taking place. That is their job. It's what they're supposed to do. Who they're looking to validate what they're doing, that is shifting. With younger kids, I think we're more apt to protect them a lot more in a good way, but there's a lot more protection. There's a lot more safety nets. There's a lot more of everybody gets a prize. And as they get older, there's a little bit more competition that takes place, and that can feel kind of intimidating. They're really dealing with vulnerability in a whole new way. You're talking about this time period where there's a lot of hormones, there's a lot of body shifting. They may not feel comfortable with who they are in their skin. They're unsure who they are in their identity. And now we're telling them, oh, but just get out on stage and do your thing. You've been great. It should be no problem. So it can be a kind of confusing time in terms of what you see with a kid who might be saying to you, I still very much love this. I still very much want to do this. But how they do it, how they show up, and what their comfort level is might look very different. And that can be confusing if you're not kind of understanding some of the developmental changes that take place.
You use the word vulnerability. We talk a lot about it in our work and on this podcast about this notion of self-worth and self-efficacy, which is a big concept for young people at this age range. And it has lots of consequences, both plus and minus. I imagine sports is probably about this as well. There's probably other domains, but there's something about performance arts particularly where you're in front of audience, you're in front of adults and peers and so forth. Do you think there's something particular about that domain that targets these vulnerabilities, and I guess in a positive way can be learning experiences to build up resiliency and sense of worth and sense of self-respect?
The interesting thing about the arts is that in order to give a really genuine product, you have to be able to tap into vulnerability. And that becomes more and more true as you get older and older in it. So for young performers, it can be a very scary thing to have to get up there and tap into those emotions and emotions that you're still trying to figure out too. A lot of times you're not even sure what's happening, and to put yourself out there, and what I was saying about like not always sure what your peers are going to say or do or think about it. So yes, the vulnerability, I think, in the creative arts is such an important thing to talk about, to be touched upon, to be talking with our young people about, helping them to understand what is vulnerability. There's always going to be moments in your life where you have to step into moments of feeling very uncomfortable and not sure how what you're doing is going to be received, and being prepared that it may not be received in a positive way, and how to do that without then flipping it into shame as opposed to flipping it into resiliency. And when you're talking about kids who are in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, this is new stuff. If you think about shame, so many people can think of an incident when they were younger where they felt shame. The first time they really felt vulnerability in a public place and it flipped into shame. some type of embarrassment, feeling bad about them as an entity themselves, who they are, what they're putting out there. So I think of the arts, if they can have these successful experiences. We're talking a lot about the performing arts, but there's other art forms too that this would be true of too. That the first time a child is comfortable sharing a painting, which really expresses a lot of deep emotions, and it might be abstract and not quote unquote make sense, but putting it out there and waiting to see how it's received. And that's a vulnerable moment right there. And how others receive that, especially their peers, can help them in terms of, do they feel good about taking those chances? Do they find a way to be resilient about taking chances? Or do they feel some shame around taking that chance?
Another frame on this, and you talk about this in the book, that I think we would characterize as a sense of agency. You talk about this concept of locus of control. Is it internal versus external? Talk a little bit about that concept. I think it overlays nicely with what we're talking about here.
Locus of control is really important. So locus of control is our understanding of what dictates how we can control outcomes of things. So is it an internally driven thing? We have control, an internal locus of control, or is it an external locus of control? So going back to like the example of talent, if you have somebody who comes from this external locus of control, their definition of talent is really going to be limited to, it's an innate talent. And it doesn't matter what you do because you don't have control. So if you don't have talent, there's no point in trying. Somebody who has a more of an internal locus of control can look at talent and say, I don't have as much natural affinity for it as my friend does, but what I do have is the ability to work hard. What I can do is try different things. And you believe that you can, through hard work, change what the outcome of something is going to be. So when I'm talking to kids about that locus of control, we really try to dig deep into what are kind of some of your underlying beliefs about your ability to change things. You'll get a kid who says, well, I just can't sing. And I challenge that because I can give them lots of evidence from talking to professional vocal coaches that it's very rare that they can't eventually teach someone to sing fairly well. How much you have to work at it, well, that might be different if you're not starting out as somebody who has naturally good tone and has a naturally good ear, so you know when you're in tune, but you can be taught those things. And if this is something important to you, are you willing to really work extremely hard at that?
And that gets to identity as well, because young people can sort of internalize this identity of a hard worker, somebody who has a go-get-em attitude. And I imagine some young people can embrace that. One way to see it is that may be defeating, I don't have the natural talent, therefore I'm not going to be as successful as somebody else. But do you find that kids can also sort of embrace that as part of their identity?
They absolutely can. And it's something that comes up a lot. It comes up when we talk about perfectionism and what is perfectionism and how does it present? Because often it presents in ways, especially kids don't always understand, that perfectionism can actually present as procrastination. And I like to talk to them about what is going on with the thoughts in their head. So we all have that inner voice. And is your inner voice saying that external or internal locus of control stuff to you that you can change the outcome? And how does that help you with your identity and your ability to feel that you can do the things you want to do, be the person you want to be, that courage almost to try on different things at various times?
That was part one of my conversation with Alaina Johnson. In part two, we talk about how parents and families can engage with creative teens and tweens in the most supportive and effective ways, some of the particular issues the current generation of youth are faced with, and Alaina's next steps in helping others understand and support their own creative teens and tweens at home. That's coming up in just a little bit on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. This is the beginning of our fourth season of the program. In the previous 3 seasons, we have had the privilege of showcasing a wide range of ideas, issues, and impact across the spectrum of young adolescent learning and development, in school and out of school. Our nearly 40 conversations to date have dealt with topics like experiential learning, career exploration, mental and behavioral health, effective teaching practices and learning environments, out of school and summer learning experiences and programs, civic engagement, race and socioeconomic influences, social and emotional learning, mentoring and developmental relationships, and many more topics, all centered around young people between the ages of 10 and 15 in the early part of adolescence. Here's a few quick snippets from our previous episodes.
What if school were more like an outward bound trip? And on an outward bound trip, it's not about any one person's success. It's about the whole team. being successful. It's about the entire group making it to the top of the mountain or out onto the ocean or down the river. And your job is not just to get yourself to the top of the mountain, it's to get all of your crewmates up to the top of that mountain. In contrast, school is kind of an individual sport, right? Like everyone out for herself or himself or their self. Everyone is trying to get ahead, and it's not your job to help anyone else. But what if school were a team sport instead of an individual sport? What if your job in school was to get every one of your crewmates and classmates into college or into successful academic career, and you're all helping each other in that way?
I think oftentimes our scholars have like these checklists of things that they're supposed to, knock off. Like, I'm a student, I need to get good grades, and I need to, be on my best behavior. Great, but what do you want to be outside of that? Like, you want to be an architect? So like, what do we know about that? Like, how can we get you there? Who can we connect you with? Because so oftentimes our mentors have so many connections that are like beyond, I think, anything that I would have understood as a middle school student. And I think our students as well probably don't understand the magnitude, but knowing that someone is there in their corner that they can see weekly that is interested and willing to put them in places or say their names in places that oftentimes they would have never had access to, that's that opportunity gap right there, right? Like, so now we have someone who's in a place that could provide or advocate on behalf of another scholar or something like that, to give them that exposure to see if this is something that they really want to do and tell them more about.
I happened to do a lot of work in a particular K-8 school, and it was just so fascinating and also heartbreaking to see some of the Black boys move from maybe even, kindergarten all the way up until like the 6th and 7th grade, because they would start out as these cute, lovable little boys that everybody just adored. And then as they moved up, like the ways in which the adults around them like shifted their stance from these, lovable kids that, we wanted to help learn to like these bodies that we had to like control.
A lot of the students, they'll come in and they'll do the whole lashing out, they'll have the attitudes, they'll be angry, whatever the case may be. There's always this tension between a teacher and a student because they both don't know what's going on in the background. So the whole point of this was to address the fact that emotions are real and they can definitely affect the way that you behave or the way that you respond or the way that you teach. So take a moment to acknowledge it.
You can catch all of our episodes on your favorite podcast platform or by visiting remakingmiddleschool.org. And now, here's part 2 of my conversation with Alaina Johnson. So let's shift now to the supporting side of things. We've been kind of touching into that. You are a parent. This book is really focused on parents and families, although, as I mentioned, educators and youth workers who spend a lot of time with young people as they navigate through these experiences that we've been talking about can get a lot out of the book as well. You have a nice framework in the book about communicating with your teen or tween. I had Dr. Ken Ginsberg and Dr. Jillian Baker from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia on a previous podcast, and they run what's called the Center for Parent and Teen Communication out of CHOP, and they have a lot of resources for both parents and young people in how to effectively engage with each other, which is not necessarily a natural or easy thing to do. We'd like to think it is, given these are our children and we are their parents, but there are some significant gaps in knowledge and skill in this regard that they try to address. And you have some great advice for parents and families throughout the book that I think is very complimentary. One is where you talk about creating a safe place for communication, really accepting both how and when the young person communicates instead of imposing our own view of that. As parents, we want to talk face to face and we want to talk now, but that may not be the best approach to get meaningful engagement. And of course, the critical but not so easy to do skill of listening. Tell us more about how parents and families, and this is a big topic, so you can take it where you want to take it, how parents and families can be most effective in engaging with their creative-driven teens and tweens in the most supportive ways.
Yes, as you said, I don't even think this is necessarily focused on just creative teens and tweens when I answer this. Of course, in the book, I put it in that context because that's kind of who I'm speaking to, but it's a general answer. One of the most important things is to learn to meet them where they're at. And so as adults, our communication style is a little bit different. We have a different skill set. And as parents, let's be honest, we have an agenda. Even if we say we're just casually trying to, we just wanted to catch up with you. What we really want is we want to know what's going on in your world. Like, we used to know everything. In fact, we used to control your world, plan your world, the whole thing. And all of a sudden you're running out the door saying you're hanging out with friends. Who are these friends? I've never heard of these friends. And where are you going to be? So I think it is important to look for the moments where and when your child wants to speak. I suggest to parents all the time, if you really want to know what's going on, volunteer to drive the carpool. Yes, it might be at 11:30 at night. You might already want to be in PJs. But man, if you can just sit there quietly, you will learn so many things. And it's not just the obvious getting clear information about things. It's the nuances of, oh, okay, let me listen to the language patterns of how they're speaking to one another. What are the words they're using? What are the words I can use that are going to resonate with them more than the way I speak to, say, my spouse or my colleague? Another joke among me and most of my other mom friends is teenagers have the unbelievable knack for waiting until you've had the longest, most stressful, exhausting day. And you finally climb into bed. And that's when you'll get the text. Are you up? Can you talk? And you're like, of course I can. And I always say, don't say to them, I'm really tired. Can we talk in the morning? I'm like, unless you're sick, talk to them. Because by morning, they'll probably be like, never mind. I don't want to talk about it. But if you get them when they're kind of coming in that space and they're ready to be open and honest, they're going to give you a lot more information. Now, when they do come to you, several things are important. Empathy. And empathy does not mean jumping in with your own agenda. Empathy means you just need to sit there and engage in active listening and sit with whatever emotion they're having. We get very uncomfortable as parents when our kids are uncomfortable, and we want to fix it. It's our natural instinct. We've been doing it since they were babies. But by the time they're tweens and teens, they need to learn how to manage their emotions by themselves. And they know that. They want to do that. What they really are looking for is support in validation around, what am I feeling? Is it normal to feel this way? And just some little reassurance that I'm going to get through it, but not necessarily a solution in the moment. So if you can sit there, try to take their perspective, be sure not to have any judgment of what they're saying, recognizing what the emotion is, even if you're not in tune with the emotion. An example I like to use sometimes with parents is, do you remember your first real breakup? It is devastating. And if we're not able to remember that, go back to that emotion, it's hard not to, as a parent, go, you're going to have so many more relationships. They're going to mean so much more than this. And this is really, trust me, not going to define your life, in any significant way down the line. That's our instinct because we don't like to see them be uncomfortable. And we want to be like, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. And if we do that, we're going to cut off that connection point. We're going to cut off that communication because they really are in pain. This is their first time feeling that kind of loss. This is their first time where some of their identity might have been tied up into, some of their identities they're trying on, and one of their temporary identities might have been tied up into being someone's boyfriend or girlfriend. And if you can just sit there with no judgment and remind yourself of that emotion and have empathy, you're going to get a lot more communication. And they're going to see you as a safe place to land, to say, I'm struggling with this, or this is happening, or I don't know what to do with this emotion, because they're not worried you're going to try to jump in and fix it for them all the time, but that you're just going to let them feel safe in their emotion.
Yeah, I have felt as a parent a big regulatory concept for me, which you alluded to, which is you often default to, well, obviously they're going to go through this multiple times in their lives, and this is not sort of a big deal, to basically stop yourself in your tracks and say, wait a second, this is the first time that they're going through this. As a parent, even just a caring adult, I think that's probably a really important way to sort of approach things, that this is the first time that they're going through some pretty weighty things. Do you find that parents are often a little bit of a step behind their kids? I've heard this concept before, like we're basically parenting them as if they were still 2 years younger. Like we haven't caught up to the parenting style that they need at that particular time because we've been in whatever parenting mode we were in when they were 10 and now they're 12 and we haven't quite caught up to that.
Yes, I believe that absolutely happens, in part because they really do developmentally change so quickly, especially in the age group we're talking about. And just when we're starting to feel competent in what we're doing and saying like, hey, they didn't run away, I figured this out. Okay, they've already moved on to something else. And I think we're also reticent to admit how mature they are at various stages. There's so many more things that are coming at our kids so much younger now. And it's very scary to admit that our kids are having to navigate some of these things so much younger than we want to mentally think they have to navigate. We're looking at our 13-year-old, and we don't want to think that they are navigating issues of maybe body image. But we live in a very different world now than the ones that we grew up in. So we have to be acknowledging that, oh yeah, you know what, this might be a thing, and let's pay attention to this, and let's have some conversations around this. And it's hard to kind of push yourself because you don't want to think of them in that way, but they are usually a little more mature than you want to admit to yourself. And being the parent that they need can be a little bit complicated.
I want to dive just a slightly deeper into that because I really think this is important and something that I've been trying to stress on this podcast for at least the last year or so. And this may have been sort of a function of COVID, but it's deeper than that. It's the idea that, are we speaking directly to the needs and experiences of young people today? We know that there are these timeless developmental aspects of teens and tweens. We talked about them here: identity development, agency, self-efficacy. But I increasingly think it's important, and you probably do this all the time given your profession, but we need to work harder to understand this particular generation of teens and tweens and the particular world in which they are living and the particular experiences that they're going through. Obviously, COVID has predominated. Social media is omnipresent, but also issues of socioeconomic stress and significant gaps in socioeconomic opportunity and, of course, physical and perhaps even more pressing mental health and well-being. As you think about youth in the creative space and you look at how parents and families are responding to and engaging with them, what have you noticed that is a product of this particular generation and our particular moment in time?
One of the things that I feel like is coming up a lot is autonomy. And how do we support autonomy? How much autonomy do we give kids? It is such a different world. And as you were saying, some of the things they are navigating is so different than anything that we have navigated. I did see the news because my family had one television and everybody watched the news from 5:30 to 6. I'm Central Time. That was what we did. That was it, though. I didn't really read the newspaper when I was young. We might have talked about current events a little bit in social studies, but there wasn't this constant bombardment of having to, at a very young age, take in all of this information, some of it incredibly stressful and overwhelming, that our kids have to take in nowadays. So when parents come to me and we're talking about how much autonomy do I give my child, it's this really crazy balance, because on the one hand, we do need to look at the world that they are living in. And we need to say, hey, where do I need to put some limits and boundaries on this? What is too much? If I'm going to let them have social media, do I say that we need to cut it off at 8 p.m.? And is that cutting off their autonomy because then we're cutting them off from their peer group? Trying to balance out that. At the same time, it's this bizarre layering where we also have not enough autonomy for our kids. Parents have access to their children in ways that just was not ever a thing before. We can see their grades posted the second that they're posted. We can track exactly where they are every minute of every day in the world. So with all that, our kids aren't getting that same freedom to explore, to make mistakes, to get out there and try new things. How often were we, when we were teens, not exactly where we told our parents we were going to be? Maybe in the ballpark. I'm at a friend's, but, it may not be the friend's house we said it was, because we know we're at a friend's house our parent doesn't really want us at, or our parent knows that there's no adult home. But there was a lot of learning that took place in that. And when things went wrong, we had to figure it out. And so when I talk to parents about being in this creative space, I get it. This is something they enjoy and they love, and you want them to have this great outcome. But you're going to have to scale back and let them navigate some of this on their own. They've got to figure out who they are. They have to learn how to deal with their own mistakes. They need to handle it when they don't get the role that they want. We can't be jumping in all the time and fixing things. So I think our kids are in this very unusual situation. At one time, they have very little autonomy because we can monitor and do all this stuff. And at the same time, they have more than we ever want because they do have access to social media. They do have access to 24/7 information. It's an interesting time for them, and it's a very interesting time to be parenting because walking that line is complicated.
The other specific thing I wanted to touch upon was this. I think this is more specific. There are probably other domains as well, but if you're in sports, you're still competing with your peers at the same general age level. There are elite players, but generally competing with their peers. When you're in performance arts, isn't it often the case that you're engaging with adults and you're also working? Are there some of those dynamics at play as well that, again, sort of feed into some of this concept that it's not just about parenting teens and tweens generally, but there's also specific things in the performance arts that have these sort of developmental impact?
I would say that that is true in the professional level. I think when you're doing casual community level, you tend to be mostly with your peer group, sometimes a little bit older. As far as the professional level, absolutely. So my middle son, as we mentioned, was on Broadway. And that meant that I dropped him at 9 years old, along with three other little 9-year-olds, off at the theater door. And we handed them over to a person, and they worked an adult job. That was just the reality of it. On the one hand, there were amazing things that happened for it. We would never give up that opportunity for him. At the same time, I think that there was definitely a period afterwards that we realized, oh, because he was focused so much on this professionalism over here, that meant that there were other things that were kind of neglected in his development that we had to give him time and space to learn and figure out. And in a strange way, I was almost grateful for having traversed that with him and having had that recognition when we did have COVID and went on lockdown. We have this whole generation now of kids who experience something very similar, where certain key developmental experiences would be happening. They didn't get to have those in the same way. For my son, there were things that his peers were doing and kind of figuring out and socially interacting. He was figuring out this whole different set of skills, which was how do I show up as a professional and on time and do my job and understand how to navigate certain situations. And he had to sign autographs afterwards. And some nights he was tired and he just wanted to go home. And he understood that, oh, this is part of it. And I'm going to have to be pleasant and positive. So absolutely, there's things that I think that can be a trade-off that you have to be careful of and make sure. My middle son, who has never wanted to do anything other than be in the performing arts on some capacity, both music and acting, he took a complete break from any kind of professional studying for about 2 years. And I think it was probably one of the best things for him, because now that he's back into it and he's doubled down on this is what I want to do, he's able to approach that with a different type of energy and excitement. Going back to the question before now, that's another layer that absolutely cannot be underestimated in how it's impacting what is going on with our kids. We have to remember that developmentally, there were some things they didn't get in there. And it wasn't just the lockdown period. We have to remember that it was probably a solid year, I would say, afterwards, where things were still very different. They were still doing a lot of learning remotely. They weren't interacting with peers in the same ways. But for the performance artists, they didn't have that community. They weren't getting together. They weren't learning those interactions. I would say the same is true for kids who are in sports. You know, what I also see a lot of is kids who are naturally introverted. They really are struggling because they got to lean into what feels really comfortable with them during that time period. And now that they don't have that reason and they do have to learn how to be social and interact in a different way, it's challenging. And I've worked with some kids now who are really kind of struggling because they didn't get to do that in the same way. Or my performance art kids who were young, so they had that whole I love shining. Right when they were hitting some reluctance to shine, the pandemic hit. Then we came out of it and they hadn't had to work through all of that in middle school. Now they're in high school and they're expected to just jump right back out there. And it's confusing, but you didn't get a chance to learn those skills at an age where people expect you to learn those skills. You're going to catch up, but it's going to take some work.
So I know this can be hard to think about this. You've just accomplished this tremendous achievement. You've written a book. You're getting it out there. You probably want to exhale a little bit. But what's next? What role do you see yourself playing in this space going forward?
I am actually having the best time ever. I'm really getting to do some of the stuff I love. And one of the things I really enjoy doing is helping the teens who want to turn this into a professional career figure out how to do that and find their path. And I've gotten some great opportunities recently to work with some people who are just outstanding in that area and are already doing that work and coming in and helping with some of the mindset part of things. And what's been really fun is helping the parents who are like, what do you mean my child wants to be a professional artist? So that's kind of the next steps, is doing that work, consulting with studio owners and parents individually, but really working with people who have already catered that group and coming in and helping them navigate some of that part.
That was Dr. Alaina Jason, author of Parenting Talent, which is available for purchase on Amazon and at other book retailers. You can follow Alaina on the web at parentingtalent.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Parenting Talent. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast and Remaking Middle School are products of Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia Center for Effective Youth Development, which you can visit online at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, N-E-X, or on Facebook and YouTube at Youth-Nex, and on Twitter X and Instagram at youth_nex. Lessons in Adolescence is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Sophia Moore. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website or on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.